Because we'd like to take you live to Canberra, where Senators Eric Abetz and Michael Ronaldson are about to speak to the media.
Inquiry. A smoking gun which reveals that 3 years ago, Fair Work Australia or its predecessor believed that there was sufficient evidence to refer to police. Also, courtesy of Fair Work Australia estimates process, we now know that Fair Work Australia was engaged in regular meetings dealing with the issue of media management. What we also know is that the answers that Senator Ronaldson and I received this morning from the Secretariat of the Senate Committee was only delivered to them last night by the Minister's Office after the close of business, after Fair Work Australia had given its evidence, as a result of which the Coalition was denied from canvassing this vitally important memo and the issue of media management. What this shows is that Minister Shorten and his office are micromanaging the Thompson affair to ensure that this sort of information only got into the public domain after Senate estimates. Mr Shorten, you will recall, has also publicly called for the non-release of the Fair Work Australia report in his capacity as Minister at a time when Labor-funded lawyers were putting exactly the same submission to the Senate Committee. Minister Shorten has a lot to answer here. We as a coalition will be seeking the recalling of Fair Work Australia for this Senate estimate process so that we can canvass these issues. These are very, very serious issues when 3 years ago the possibility of police action was contemplated. The particular memo to which I refer was obtained as a result of Senator Ronaldson's questioning, and I will now throw over to Senator Ronaldson.
Well, thank you, Eric. I think the first thing to note is the Prime Minister herself was the Workplace Relations Minister at the time of the Williams release, and also that Mr Shorten's office would have had to have cleared this answer, so he would have had that answer well before 5 o'clock last night. I do refer you to the Williams letter, and in particular you'll see in paragraph 3 that Mr Williams said that as the outcome of inquiries to date, that there was now a reason to refer this matter off to the police, and I draw particularly your attention to the last sentence, which says, which do not require further investigation. So on the 30th of June 2009, Mr Williams said there had been sufficient work to identify malfeasance. It should have been referred off to the police without further investigation. Clearly, on the back of the failure of the government yesterday to answer my questions, put on notice via the Parliamentary Secretary Collins in February, asking what contact was there between Craig Thompson and former Minister Evans and current Minister Shorten in relation to the Fair Work Australia inquiry, and you can see from the information you have been provided today that they point-blank refuse to provide that answer. The only answer to that question now can be that there has been discussions between Mr Thompson and Mr Evans and or Mr Shorten, and the Prime Minister herself must now clearly identify what were the nature and extent of those discussions.
From this, email, is it? It's hardly a smoking gun in terms of the Prime Minister or any of the ministers telling Fair Work Australia not to take it to the police, is it?
Well, the issue with this is that back in the 30th of June 2009, as you'll see from paragraph 3, there should be a clear plan and actions arising from the outcome of the inquiries to date, including a referral to the police, which can occur on the strength of discoveries from inquiries which do not require further investigation. Now, the answer to this has got to be what has been the involvement of any and which government ministers in relation to this information.
And the other point is, if I may add, over the page, Mr Williams says the actions identified should be implemented expeditiously. 3 years later, Fair Work Australia is still struggling to refer it to police. They did it via the Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions 3 years after it was urged that this be done expeditiously.
You don't accept an explanation that the new Fair Work Australia, which came into existence the very next day, took a bit longer to get its head around it?
We do not accept any excuse for these delays. The simple fact is the handover brief from Mr Williams clearly identified malfeasance, the recommendation that it be reported to police and that it be done so expeditiously. Mr Williams was not appointed as the new manager of Fair Work Australia. Mr Tim Lee was, and Mr Lee should be answering as to why he did not follow Mr Doug Williams' very strong advice, given that Mr Williams had had carriage of the matter through the old Australian Industrial Relations Commission to that point in time.
The changeover of the organisation was a name. You'll see on this memorandum that it is to Mr Terry Nassios. So the investigation continued. The change of name to Fair Work had no impact on that whatsoever.
Isn't it the case they did draft a plan, but that plan came to, we shouldn't, by law, refer this to police?
Or the obfuscation by Fair Work Australia that they couldn't refer these matters to police has been completely and utterly debunked by Stuart Wood SC's very strong opinion, to which Fair Work Australia then responded with what could only be termed a very lame opinion from the Australian Government solicitor. And when I asked for the initial advice to Mr Lee suggesting that he couldn't do so, miraculously there was no written advice in relation to that aspect. Clearly Fair Work Australia, as indeed any public agency, if they come across the potential of a crime having been committed, they have an obligation to report it to the police, and Mr Williams saw no problem with reporting this to the police.
Why didn't you push this harder 3 years ago when it was all on the public record on the front page of the Herald?
We were not advised about all the details that are now coming to light, but what we do know is that 3 years ago people were aware that this was a matter that could have and should have been reported to the police.
You were suspicious in your capacity as Shadow IR Minister back then?
Well, in 2009, I don't think I was Shadow IR Minister. I was Innovation, Industry, Science and Research.
Should your Shadow IR Minister have been more suspicious given?
We were monitoring the situation, but the information was not coming out. What we did know was an investigation had been held, but the very strong advice of the man in charge, Mr Williams, had not come into the public domain. Mr Shorten has ensured that it's only come into the public domain today, and on the strength of that, we as a coalition believe, and if I might say especially Senator Ronaldson is entitled to believe, that his ongoing prosecution of this matter over 3 years in Senate estimates, being stonewalled on every occasion, has been completely justified and vindicated with a presentation of this document.
There's a time Nassios fronted the kid.
Well, one of the difficulties is that Mr Nassios won't be answering in relation to this and why he did not take the advice of Mr Williams, and it is a matter of regret that Senate estimates will not have the pleasure of Mr Nassios before it until February 2013. How about one last question?
There's a section of this memo that's been redacted. Do you have any idea what is in that, and can you tell us why it's been redacted?
I understand it's in relation to some question of legal privilege, but over and above that there's no answer given in there. Can I just quickly draw your attention please to again Mr Williams' letter, where he says in B2 that forms of notification to parties of this investigation should be drawn up and issued, and that was on the 30th of June 2009.
All right.
If Fair Work comes back, what are the key questions for the estimates committee?
The key question is, why did Fair Work Australia not act on the advice of the former Industrial Registrar, Mr Williams, that these matters should be referred to the police, and the notices that Senator Ronaldson has just referred to issued in relation to potential...
Do you answer this question, or is it for others to answer?
Oh, well, look, KPMG, I understand, is undertaking an investigation into the investigation. I'm not sure they'll take us much further. All right,
well, we would just quickly, we would like Mr Lee to answer the questions with these regular meetings that Senator Abetz has ascertained through FOI. Indeed, what was the communication following on from those meetings with the Minister at the time, the Prime Minister, or indeed after that with Ministers Evans or Shorten? This is obviously a complete and utter cover-up by the government, and they've got to answer these questions immediately.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, Senators Michael Ronaldson and Eric Abetz holding a media conference there about the latest turn of events in the HSU investigation, some allegations made against Michael Lawler, and those two senators saying that the government appears to have conducted a cover-up